I'm Paul Sibley. I lead enterprise sales at Odesk, and I'm very grateful to have asked two individuals to join me today. I'll ask them to introduce themselves, and I'll explain why I have them up here in a moment. So, Matt?
Sure. Hi, I'm Matt Swanson, managing partner of Silicon Valley Software Group, where my firm helps companies integrate crowdsourcing into their organization. That's probably good enough.
Hi, I'm Praveen Paratosh. I work at Google. I'm an engineer. I've been working on harnessing both human and machine intelligence to build amazing software. And I've been working in this crowdsourcing space for the last over 5 years, also known as human computation in more academic scholarly circles. So I'll be using both terminologies occasionally. All right.
So the reason I've asked both these people up here today is they both played a part in some projects we've been working on with enterprise clients. So Praveen is actually a customer of ours at Google, and he certainly is leveraging what we call expert crowds. We've heard a lot recently about micro-tasking and things where maybe small judgments are taking place. In expert tasks, we see that as perhaps multiple tasks strung together to make up what we call a job. And Matt here, Matt is partnered with us on some internal work as well as some client projects whereby technology is playing a part to orchestrate that work. So in terms of outlining what an expert task is for a couple of examples, I wanted Praveen just to give it a high level what he's been doing with some of the Odesk crowd.
So there's, is this on? Yeah. There's two, so I work on, one of the projects that I've been working on was called Freebase. It's a database of everything. It's like Wikipedia for machines. It's like IMDb, but contains information about locations, books, people, places, movies, everything. So this requires, building such a database requires a huge amount of human curation work. There's two broad kinds of questions that we ask the expert crowd. One is asking if these two different entities coming from different databases are indeed exactly the same. So there might be a movie on, there might be a DVD on the Netflix website, and there might be a Wikipedia entry for a movie. And the DVD might not be exactly referring to the same movie. It might be a director's cut. So there are nuances to this from domain to domain. And the second task we do is verifying whether a fact follows from evidence that's provided. So these are the kinds of tasks that would be traditionally done by researchers, analysts, ontologists. There are fancy names. But we need to scale asking these type of questions. We need to ask millions of questions like this. And that means that we need to build a scalable source of reliable ways to answering these questions. That's examples of things that we think are difficult. The reason I say that these are difficult tasks, because in some experiments that we did using untrained crowds, we found that people were basically a chance accuracy. So you might as well toss a coin. And so that meant that we needed to do something to get better than that, because it wouldn't be useful to collect data that's just random. And that meant like educating the workers, training, thinking about what it means to do complex tasks in this framework.
Great. Another example of some work we're doing that's revolving around expert work is around content creation. So content to one individual may mean something entirely different to another customer, so it's not necessarily a micro task, and you can certainly break that down into a micro task on basic work. We have customers that are looking for very complex and lengthy pieces of content that may even involve multimedia. And I wanted to get maybe Matt's perspective on how technology plays a part to help orchestrate this process around content creation.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a big category of crowdsourcing work nowadays. And if you look at the requirements for content generation, you'll see that you can have a lot of details. You can have 10 pages of guidelines to require the workers to conform to some sort of standard. And when you're trying to do a task like that, it's really challenging to use traditional platforms with generic workforces. And so what we found is that by having dedicated workers, people who actually have some basic requirements vetted by a community, maybe like Odesk or other workforces out there, you can actually improve your quality quite a bit by having that sort of process in place. And I think this speaks to your task as well, where you have your indexing and ontology. Those are complicated processes. These are not micro tasks that you can just say binary yes or no answers to. And so at the end of the day, having detailed requirements is part of the solution and the technology to validate those requirements, but having the vetted workforce is a very important part of these sort of content generation and ontology tasks.
Right. And in looking at some of the work that we're doing around expert tasks, we don't necessarily put this out to a general crowd. We actually source and vet, and there's some strategies that I know even Google has employed to help really curate and select that crowd to ensure they're the right type of people, and even ongoing as the progress is taking place, are they still the right worker relative to what we signed them up for to begin with? What are some of the strategies you've worked with, Praveen, to help go through those processes of selecting that workforce and even vetting them?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of things that a platform like Odesk helps. There's tests, for instance, and qualifications on Mechanical Turk. They're useful, but they're not quite, they don't go all the way, because the task that we're doing is knowledge-based construction. And there isn't really today a qualification or an appropriate test that tells you how good you are at understanding structured data. Maybe in the future there'll be an actual bachelor's degree that some university can grant, but we don't have that. So we have to kind of make guesses about what kind of skills would be useful. So we're looking for people who care about subtlety, who care about nuances, who care about details, and so who like doing research. So we have devised a set of tests, and we have a training sort of program which we go through to make sure that they can actually do the kind of tasks that we're hiring them for. And there is somewhat extensive investment that we have to make to get a worker, and so that's very different. It might take weeks or even months to figure out whether a worker is suitable for this kind of task.
Right. And Matt, conversely, what are some of the things you're doing with the technology to help even support activities like Praveen describes around the vetting process or even upfront testing?
Yeah, I'd say that there are technology solutions that augment the manual process of vetting a workforce. You can come up with requirements that you can place qualifications against and start to build that data set of workers. And then ultimately, you can orchestrate your workforce and have them centralized on a platform where some sort of oversight is done, and you can manage those workers against those qualifications. I would say, though, that these sort of tasks, we're talking about your non-traditional microtasking, right? So you're going to have a different strategy for managing that workforce than you would say content or moderation, where you're wanting to get very simple responses from your workforce. And so there will be manual oversight. You will have to integrate some sort of internal presence, whether that be a private crowd or a crowd on Odesk. But using that along with your existing public crowd, you can have the technology to bridge those two workforces together and solve some of these problems.
Great. And Praveen, you mentioned some of the investments that are necessary when you're employing an expert crowd, and certainly you want to have some longevity with the folks that you bring onto the team. What are the projects employing to help, I guess, provide some progression for these people so they actually see something down the road versus, I guess, highly repetitive work over maybe months or years?
Yeah, I think you have to, if you're investing in your workers, you have to make it interesting for them. I think it's useful to have people who have learned and skills that are relevant to the task and keep them around for as much as you can. And so I think that that's, I guess the slide is on. So maybe I'll use that slide as an explanation anchor for some of the things that I'm talking about. There is nothing on the slide that's very precise, but it's supposed to give you an idea of like the spectrum of complexity of computational tasks. So on the left-hand side is things that you can really cheaply, freely automate. Okay, arithmetic is totally that, right? We had calculators long time ago. So you could do that using machine. Chess is kind of surprising that you can automate chess, but we knew that like 15 years ago. So people didn't think that that'll be there. And the line in the middle is the Turing test. That's the theoretical line that divides stuff that can be automated and stuff that can't be automated and requires a human. And so if you think about CAPTCHAs, the annoying little things that you have to solve, they're supposed to be theoretically the simplest thing that humans can do but computers can't do. And that's still the CAPTCHA line, and the Turing test line keeps shifting around as we make progress. And on the right side of that is stuff that only humans can do. So things that involve language, speech, and vision, things that require like professional certification, so not stuff that everybody can do, but somebody with like say 3-4 years of education can do. And all the way to the right is like a very, very expensive consultant. Like we don't really know how to automate that yet. And so if you look at the bottom of that slide, we have things like, we have Mechanical Turk, Mechanical Turk is probably capable of doing all of these things, but bulk of tasks that are happening are tasks that are actually closer to the language, speech, vision, Turing test line. So image labeling, speech transcription, things like that. And so what we found is that when we tried to do complex tasks, that really just required training. If we're not getting good enough results, we need to train the workers. And so we had to figure out ways to identify the workers, to scale the act of training itself, to generate the training materials. Where do they come from? So it turns out you can use the crowd to develop the guidelines and training materials by debugging, by using the crowd to debug and extend and find holes in the guidelines. And so let me come back to the question you asked.
Which was around the, I guess, the progression of you offer to these workers over time.
Yes,
and
yes. So what's really interesting is if you're trying to do more interesting, complicated work, you want people to have a sense of value and enjoy the work. It's not a repetitive, mechanical, simple micro task that they have to do over and over again. So variety of work is interesting, different ways to contribute while doing the task. So you could be doing the task, but simultaneously debugging the task at a higher level, pointing out issues with the guidelines or the task itself. And we could recognize that kind of contribution in a different way. So these are some examples to keep the work interesting enough for the worker to give them a chance to contribute at higher levels at the same task. So you might begin by doing some simple tasks or shadowing existing workers, but soon you might be designing the task itself, not soon, but maybe it will take different amounts of time for different people. So the idea of giving people interesting and varied work and giving them an opportunity to contribute at different levels is perhaps important for these expert type tasks.
in our conversation yesterday, Praveen, you were talking about CAPTCHA in particular, just how it's probably the largest crowdsourcing effort out there today. And it also serves as a purpose to actually optimize the machine. And over time, we were speaking about how this line may shift. How do you see this evolving over time?
Yeah, so you might have seen that CAPTCHAs are getting a little difficult these days. and it's because, you know, what's happening with CAPTCHAs, that they're generating data that is being used to train a computer program to get better at vision. And it is the largest crowdsourcing project. I think it's over 1 billion people have solved a CAPTCHA. And one thing that's happening is that line that is dividing stuff between what computers can do and what humans can do is shifting. So the stuff that's really close to the CAPTCHA Turing test line is going to be increasingly automated. So one of our hunches is that the interesting aspects of crowdsourcing in the next few years might be a little more complexity in the kinds of tasks that go through these. And so not only as a place where there is a lot of interesting research opportunities, but it's perhaps the direction in which we as a field should think about moving. And there is very little spotlight on the work that is complex right now. Most of the research community is focused on simpler tasks. And I think that the idea that line is going to shift towards the right, it's going to get more darker blue over time.
Yeah, and I would just extend on that. I believe that is the progression of crowdsourcing, is to push that boundary of what can be crowdsourced. We see that there are tasks that have been modeled effectively through platforms like Mechanical Turk and vendors out there. And for tasks that are beyond that, There are vetted workforces like Odesk that have communities of people who have qualifications that can do those higher level tasks. And the challenge with Odesk is, or of crowdsourcing is, how can we come up with the right sort of data on the workforces so that we can keep pushing that boundary further, so our online work community starts doing more and more complicated tasks. And I think that's what this slide is trying to represent.
Right.
There's a lot to be learned from like the traditional models of employment in some sense, because as you go towards the right, you're kind of pushing towards the ideas that we figured out about organizations and managers and employment would be really handy as we move towards the more complex tasks.
Well, to summarize, I think one thing I'm finding with our clients is they're really challenging us as a provider in working with people like Matt and our large crowds and how we address these expert tasks. Certainly, there are use cases that fit in very nicely, but there are all a lot of use cases that are more complex and don't quite easily fit. So as things mature with technology and our ability to better understand the quality of our workers, we are able to better address that work. And want to thank Praveen for the work he's done at Google and Matt for his support in some of our client internal projects. Thank you.